I agree, and indeed deeply agree, that the United States has an unparalleled historic commitment to religious liberty that endures and is in overall very good shape to the present day. I do think it is worth thinking about in sort of political philosophy terms for a minute. There is one kind of seam within that understanding of religious liberty that goes all the way back to, in certain ways, the father of Anglo-American liberalism, John Locke, which is this question of whether individual religious freedom also applies in sort of corporate terms. And Locke, of course, was famously a champion of religious toleration, wrote eloquently on that front, but was not a champion of religious toleration for all groups. And in particular, he was not a champion of political toleration for Roman Catholics in late 17th century England, for understandable reasons, given the political and religious disputes of the time. But the sort of implicit and explicit arguments that Locke made about Catholic loyalty to the Roman Catholic Church and sort of how that played out in political terms and so on, I think have remained as a kind of sort of buried element in our religious debates that tends to bubble up to the surface often when the Catholic Church in the United States in particular comes into conflict with civil authorities. And obviously this was true in a much more pronounced way in the late 19th century in debates over the Blaine Amendments and sort of educational policy. But I think it's also been true over the past couple years in the debates about the contraception mandate. And I think it may well become even more pronounced in ways that extend in broader ways to encompass Protestant and Jewish institutions even more as well in future debates about marriage law and gay rights and how the possible sort of constitutionalization of gay marriage ends up impacting religious institutions, schools, and so on. And the issue here is just the question of what is the religious liberty that the First Amendment guarantees? And I think everybody, or practically everybody, left, right, and everywhere in between, agrees that that the First Amendment guarantees a freedom of worship, right? It is simply unimaginable to me that we will ever live in an American republic in which people are, with the exception of obviously religions demand human sacrifice and these sort of crucial First Amendment gray areas, that we'll ever live in a country where that right, the right of sort of congregations to hold to particular theologies and hold particular liturgical celebrations and so on, is ever challenged. The question is going beyond that. What does the free exercise of religion mean? And in particular, does that free exercise clause guarantee something broader to religious institutions that are not necessarily churches holding worship services, but are, let's say, large employers running hospitals and charitable institutions and so on? And from that perspective, I think what was troubling to a lot of religious conservatives and to EJ originally before the Obama White House changed its position in some form was the distinction that the White House policy was drawing, and we can talk about whether they continued to draw that distinction after they changed the policy, between churches who had one particular set of rights under the First Amendment and, say, Catholic hospitals, or ultimately perhaps evangelical colleges or charitable organizations and so on, who had a more restricted form of religious freedom. And I think the reason that distinction was troubling is because, in part, if you look at both the American religious present and the likely American religious future, at least given the trajectory we're on, America, as we are today, is a country that is, I think, as religious, arguably, as we've ever been, but less institutionally religious than we've ever been, maybe not ever before, but certainly in the last 50 to 75 to 100 years. And so in the popular conception, where a sort of do-it-yourself spirituality has more play and sort of institutional religious commitments have less influence, I think the argument that the First Amendment protects freedom of belief, freedom of sort of intellect, and freedom of worship, but not necessarily freedom of religious sort of activism, action through hospitals, charities, and so on, is more powerful today than it would have been a couple generations ago, and may become more powerful. And you can imagine a kind of feedback loop, and I think you actually saw this in the contraception issue, where I think the Obama White House's policy would have been unimaginable politically in a world where the Catholic Church hadn't just passed through 10 or 15 years where, thanks to the sex abuse crisis, it was a sort of period of sort of self-inflicted wounds that dramatically weakened the church's public witness and political influence. I think, to go back to the Clinton era, you can't imagine President Clinton picking that kind of fight with the Catholic bishops because, as an institution, the Catholic Church was stronger then. And so you can imagine this sort of feedback mechanism where institutional religion gets weaker, the claims of the state advance to fill that gap, and that further weakens religious institutions and so on. And I think all of us, liberal, conservative, secular, religious, have good reason to see the particularly important role that institutional religion has played in the US over the last 250 years, and to worry about any kind of cycle that sort of that weakens the churches and synagogues and mosques' ability to play that role in the future. And so that's sort of the case for a modest pessimism. And to end on a slightly more optimistic note, I do think that to religious observers, particularly religious conservatives, who leap from that pessimism to a sort of deeper vision of real persecution, I think actually the history of the Catholic experience, not only in the US, but going back hundreds and thousands of years, should be instructive, that actually there's a lot of space between perfect religious liberty and back to the catacombs persecution. And I think even if we get in this sort of negative cycle, from a Catholic perspective, passed through centuries where the church had to deal with kings appointing bishops and handing dioceses to, sort of shiftless nephews of dukes and all the rest of it. I mean, the Catholic Church has dealt with these kind of challenges before in ways that have not necessarily led to martyrdom and persecution. I think that's more what we're likely to see if my pessimistic scenario is correct, and just a sort of low-level church-state struggle that doesn't necessarily lead to truly negative or truly disastrous outcomes.